The weekend started like any other, a chance to escape the grind, visit family, and just enjoy a little peace and quiet. Hannah, my wife, was all about these kinds of trips, always looking forward to family time. It was a little tradition for us to head up to the cabin, the one our parents had tucked away in the woods. It's simple, rustic, and quiet, a perfect place to get away from the chaos of everyday life. I didn't think much of it when we packed up the car early Friday morning. Hannah was excited, making small talk about everything we'd be doing, like hiking and playing board games at night. As we got on the road, I noticed she was acting a little off. It was subtle, not a big change, but enough to make me think twice. She kept texting on her phone the whole drive, but I brushed it off. I'm not the type to be overly suspicious. When we got to the cabin, things seemed normal at first. My parents were already there, along with Branton, my brother. He'd just gotten out of a tough relationship, and I could tell he was trying to make the best of it. It was good to have him around. We hadn't spent a lot of time together lately, not with his business taking off and all. But the way he smiled at Hannah when we walked in, really smiled, something about it felt off. At dinner, my mom made her famous meatloaf, and we all sat around the big wooden table. I remember laughing at my dad's corny jokes and how Branton and Hannah kept looking at each other in this weird way. It was subtle, but it was there. Every time someone cracked a joke, they'd glance at each other like they shared some private joke I wasn't a part of. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was nothing, right? Hannah and Branton had always gotten along, so I figured I was imagining things. After dinner, we all went for a walk by the lake. My mom stayed back, and my dad went off to take a nap in his room. The rest of us, Hannah, Branton, and I, decided to stretch our legs. Branton and Hannah fell into step beside each other, while I lagged behind, kicking at the dirt. The air was crisp, and the sky had that perfect twilight glow. It should have been a peaceful moment, but all I could focus on was how Branton and Hannah were walking so close together. They weren't holding hands or anything obvious like that, but their shoulders brushed every few steps, and they were laughing too much at things that weren't funny. I tried to tell myself that I was just being weird, that maybe they were just bonding, but it felt wrong, too wrong. And when I caught them sneaking glances at each other when they thought I wasn't looking, that hit me hard. But I didn't say anything, not yet. I figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Everyone deserves a little privacy, right? A moment of closeness, especially on a trip like this. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in my stomach. Something wasn't right. That night, we all sat around the fireplace, talking about old times. The evening was supposed to end with us playing cards, but I found myself watching Hannah and Branton more closely than I should have. I kept thinking, what's going on with you two? But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to make a scene over something that could be nothing. But deep down, I knew something was off. Before I went to bed, I noticed that Hannah had left her phone on the kitchen counter. It was lying face up, the screen unlocked. I told myself not to look. I trusted her. But my curiosity got the better of me. I glanced at the screen. There was a text from Branton, and my heart skipped a beat. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. I'll make sure Jack stays out of the way. Just you and me. I didn't even need to see more. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I didn't know what to do. My mind went blank. Was I reading this wrong? Had I completely misinterpreted everything? But I couldn't unsee it now. It was like the floor dropped out from under me. I grabbed Hannah's phone, turned around, and walked out onto the porch without even thinking. My hands were shaking, and I could barely catch my breath. What the hell was going on? Was I really seeing what I thought I was seeing? It wasn't until I heard the door creak open behind me that I knew I couldn't hide anymore. Hannah was standing there in the doorway, wearing that look, the look she always had when she knew she was caught in something. It was a mix of guilt and irritation, like she was about to lie her way out of something big. "Jack, what are you doing?" she asked, trying to act casual, but I could see the panic creeping into her voice. I didn't answer. I just turned the phone around, showing her the message. Her face went pale. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, but the words got stuck. "Jack, it's not what you think. I swear," she stammered, her voice trembling. But I could see it, right there in her eyes. She knew she was busted. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the phone at her face. But all I could do was stand there, looking at her with a mixture of shock and rage. My own wife, sleeping with my brother. The two people I trusted most in the world. "Don't lie to me, Hannah," I finally managed to say. My voice was hoarse, like I was choking on my own words. She was quiet for a second, maybe trying to figure out what her next move was. Then she spoke, her voice shaky but full of that defensive tone. I don't know what you think you saw, but this is all just a misunderstanding, Jack. I love you. You know I do. I was just, she trailed off, like she didn't even have the words anymore. But I didn't care about her excuses. Not anymore. Yeah. Well, I'm done. My voice was cold now. I didn't recognize myself in that moment, but I was done. I had to be. And just like that, everything in my life, everything I thought I knew, came crashing down. The air in the cabin felt heavier after that moment, suffocating even. Hannah went back inside, and I stayed out there on the porch, staring at the phone like it was some kind of toxic thing I couldn't put down. My mind was racing, running in circles. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to do anything to release the anger that was building up inside me. But instead, I stood there frozen. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that my wife, the woman I had spent years building a life with, was so careless. And with Branton, of all people. The worst part wasn't even that it was happening. It was that they thought I was so blind, so stupid, that I wouldn't notice. That I wouldn't catch on to the way they were acting. Those quiet moments, the stolen glances. The thing is, they didn't even try to hide it. They probably thought I wouldn't care enough to notice. Or maybe they didn't even think I would ever find out. I could hear voices from inside the cabin. Hannah probably trying to explain herself, but I didn't care enough to listen. I was too busy trying to make sense of it all. My hands were shaking, and every breath I took felt like it was being torn out of my chest. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about everything. The trust one had in her, in Branton, was shattered beyond repair. They had broken something so deep inside me that I didn't even know how to begin fixing it. Eventually, I went back inside, but I didn't even look at Hannah. I could feel the weight of her presence, like she was waiting for me to say something, anything. But I couldn't. Not yet. I had to think. I needed to process it all. My eyes kept drifting to Branton, who had somehow stayed quiet through all of this. He wasn't even looking at me, just staring down at his plate like nothing was wrong. I wanted to walk over, shove the truth into his face, but instead, I just watched him. Every time he glanced at me, there was a flicker of something. Guilt, fear, I couldn't tell. But I could see it. The weight of the secret he was carrying was starting to crack him. He wasn't the same Branton I used to know. The confident guy who could talk his way out of anything. Now, he just seemed small, weak. But it wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. He had betrayed me too. Not just as a brother, but as a man who should have known better. He was supposed to have my back. Instead, he'd turned on me in the worst possible way. He didn't care about our family. He didn't care about me. He only cared about his own desires. Later that night, when everyone went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the images in my head, the way Branton smiled at Hannah, the way she laughed at things that weren't funny, the way they acted like they had their own little world. Every little thing added up until the whole picture was clear. The affair had been going on for a while. It wasn't a one-time slip. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. And the worst part was knowing that I hadn't seen it until now. All those moments, all those signs, I had been too blind to understand. How had I missed it? I couldn't stay in the cabin another minute. I needed to get away from them, to clear my head, to find a way to get control of my emotions. I grabbed my jacket and went for a walk by the lake. The cold night air cut through me like a blade, but I didn't feel it. My mind was too far gone. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the fact that I had given them everything. I had trusted them. I had opened myself up to them both. And they had taken that trust and ripped it apart. As I stood there by the water, staring out into the dark, I realized something. I couldn't just let this slide. I couldn't walk away from it. There was no going back. They needed to understand what they had done. They needed to feel the weight of their actions. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. Not for a second. When I went back inside, I knew things were going to be different. They might have thought I was just going to brush it off. But I wasn't. I wasn't going to forgive this. Not now, not ever. And I wasn't going to let them go unpunished. The next few days felt like a blur. I stayed quiet, said barely anything, while the gears in my head turned. I wasn't sure what I wanted yet, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to go unnoticed. It wasn't just about feeling betrayed. It was about making sure they paid for what they'd done. I wasn't going to let it slide. I was going to make them both understand just how deep this cut. I didn't know how I was going to do it yet, but I was going to make sure they both regretted every second of what they'd done. The next couple of days were a strange kind of hell. I kept my distance from both Hannah and Branton, my presence in the cabin as cold and distant as I felt. I was trying to hold it together, trying to figure out the right move, but the truth was, I was already simmering. The anger was eating me up from the inside, and I knew I needed to do something about it. But I also needed to be smart. I couldn't just lash out. I had to think this through, plan it carefully. Hannah, of course, kept trying to talk to me. She'd approach me while I was making coffee, or when I was sitting on the porch, pretending like nothing was wrong, trying to act like everything was fine. It made my skin crawl. She would apologize, say things like, "I never meant for it to happen, Jack," or "You know I love you, right?" But it all sounded empty, like she was trying to convince herself more than me. It wasn't the first time she'd used those words to get out of trouble. And it wasn't going to work this time. The thing that hurt the most wasn't even her lies. It was that she didn't seem to realize how deep the betrayal ran. She thought a few apologies and sad looks would fix everything. But I wasn't buying it. Not anymore. I was done. As for Branton, he stayed quiet. He kept his distance too, but I could see the guilt eating away at him. He was acting all awkward, trying to be the big brother again, cracking jokes and making small talk, but there was no escaping the tension. I saw him looking at me out of the corner of his eye more than once. He could tell I knew. He could feel the weight of it too, and I wasn't going to make it easy for him. I wanted him to feel the heat of it. I wanted him to know that every minute he spent in that cabin was a minute closer to the inevitable storm I was about to unleash. But I had to bide my time. I had to make sure everything fell into place before I moved. I didn't want to make the mistake of rushing in, not with something this big. This wasn't just about hurting them in the moment. It was about making sure they never, ever forgot what they did to me. So, I waited. I stayed out of the way, acting like everything was normal, but my mind was racing. I knew I had the power to ruin both their lives. It wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about balance. They had taken everything from me. My trust, my family, my peace of mind, and now I was going to take back what was mine. Piece by piece. It didn't take long before I started putting the wheels in motion. First, I started talking to people. Not about the affair, not yet, but about Branton's business. I knew enough about his financial struggles to make some calls. I had contacts who owed me favors. People who could leak information about some of the shady dealings he'd been involved in. Nothing too obvious at first, just rumors, whispers that would start to spread through the right circles. It didn't take much. Branton's reputation was already on thin ice with some people. All it needed was a little push, and everything he'd worked so hard for would start to unravel. But I wasn't done yet. I knew I had to hit Hannah where it hurt too. Branton had his career, his image, but Hannah had something even more fragile, her reputation. She was all about appearances, all about keeping up the image of the perfect life. It wasn't just about how people saw her, it was about the power she derived from their approval. So, I started talking to our mutual friends. I made sure they knew what had happened. I didn't have to give them the full details, just enough to get the rumors circulating. At first, they didn't believe it. Of course, they didn't. No one ever does when it's something this shocking. But all it took was a little more nudging. A couple of conversations here, a few texts there, and before long, I started hearing the whispers in the background. Friends who used to call Hannah to hang out started canceling plans. People stopped returning her calls. It was subtle at first, but the damage was done. Hannah, for all her charm and social grace, couldn't escape the gossip. And when people started treating her differently, when they stopped looking at her with the same admiration, it hit her harder than I think she expected. She was used to being the center of attention, the one people leaned on, the one who always had the perfect life. Now, she was starting to see cracks in that facade, and I could tell it was starting to eat at her. But that was just the beginning. I needed to see Branton squirm more. I needed to make sure he felt the weight of what he'd done, that it wasn't just some mistake or lapse in judgment. I wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. So, I started planning the final blow. I was going to confront him head-on, but not until I was sure everything else had fallen into place. By the time the weekend was coming to an end, I was ready. I could feel the tension building up, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Hannah had already stopped trying to explain herself to me. She knew it was too late for that. Branton, on the other hand, seemed to be avoiding me more than ever. He could feel the storm coming, and he didn't know how to stop it. Neither of them did. And neither of them had any idea what was waiting for them when I finally made my move. By the time Sunday afternoon rolled around, the air felt thick with tension. It was like we were all just going through the motions, pretending everything was fine, when in reality, everything was falling apart at the seams. I knew it. They knew it. And the worst part? Neither of them had the guts to confront me, not directly. Hannah was still trying to act normal, still trying to fix things with me, but her attempts were more like a sinking ship trying to stay afloat with a bucket and a prayer. As for Branton, he was in full avoidance mode. He'd been quieter than usual, disappearing into his room or taking walks by himself. It was almost like he was waiting for something. And in a way, I guess he was. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when I made one last call. I'd been working behind the scenes, making sure the rumors about Branton's business were spreading, but now I needed to go for the kill. I called a contact in the local media, someone I'd known from a past job, and dropped a little hint about some shady financial dealings that had been going on with one of Branton's recent deals. I didn't even have to give all the details. Just a little whisper in the right ear, and it was enough to set the wheels turning. Within hours, the story hit the local news. Branton's company was suddenly under investigation for possible fraud. I didn't care about the details. All I knew was that the timing was perfect. The media attention was just enough to make people question everything. The whispers went from private conversations to public conversations. People started talking about Branton behind his back, and the story spread faster than I could have imagined. Hannah, too, was starting to feel the heat. She couldn't escape it. When we went to the cabin for breakfast that morning, she tried to act like nothing had changed. But the silence between us had grown so heavy, it was like trying to breathe underwater. Every time she spoke, it was like she was walking on eggshells, trying to keep things light and normal. But I wasn't playing along anymore. And it was starting to break her down. I caught a glimpse of her face when she checked her phone. Her eyes widened as she read a text, and I could tell she was getting the same information about Branton's business that I had already set in motion. She looked up at me, her expression tight, but I didn't react. I just watched her. I could see the panic start to settle in as she realized what was coming for her, too. It wasn't just Branton's career that was at risk now. Her social life, her reputation, everything she'd built her identity around, was starting to crumble. And all the while, I stayed quiet, letting it all sink in. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me angry. They had taken that from me already. Now, I was just letting the consequences fall into place. When Branton finally came down for breakfast, he looked like a man who had been hit by a truck. The light in his eyes was gone. The cocky, self-assured swagger he used to carry had vanished. He was a shell of the person I'd once looked up to. I didn't care. He tried to make small talk, like everything was normal. But I could see the way he was avoiding my eyes, like he was waiting for the inevitable. I could feel his guilt, thick in the air between us. It was like I could hear his thoughts, even though he wasn't saying a word. He knew. He knew what was coming. He couldn't hide from it anymore. Hannah wasn't any better. She kept trying to act like everything would blow over, like I'd just forget about it all and we could go back to being a family. She didn't get it, though. She didn't understand that what they'd done wasn't something I could ever forget, let alone forgive. And as the day wore on, it became clearer to me. They had no idea what I was about to do to them. At one point, I stepped outside to clear my head. The afternoon sun was just starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the property. I walked down to the dock, where I used to spend hours fishing with my dad, trying to keep the noise in my head from overwhelming me. The ripples in the water felt calming, like everything was moving forward, and I had to keep moving forward, too. That's when the idea hit me. The confrontation. It had to happen. It wasn't enough for them to feel the consequences from afar. They needed to hear it from me. They needed to see the wreckage they'd caused, face to face. I didn't care anymore about being subtle or waiting for the right time. The right time was now. It was time to make them feel the full weight of what they'd done, and make sure they understood that their lives would never be the same after this weekend. I didn't want them to just feel sorry or regretful. I wanted them to understand that there was no coming back from this. So, I made up my mind. I was going to confront them, both of them, in front of the family. It wasn't going to be a private affair. It was going to be loud. It was going to be messy. And when it was over, they'd never look at each other, or me, the same way again. They would understand what betrayal really meant. I walked back to the cabin, my heart pounding. I didn't know exactly how it would play out, but I didn't care. It was time to let the storm hit. And when it did, it was going to leave nothing standing in its wake. I could feel it building inside me, that tight knot of fury that was waiting to burst. The moment I walked back into the cabin, I could sense the shift. Hannah and Branton were still pretending, but their masks were starting to slip. They could feel the pressure building, the walls closing in. They were playing nice, but I wasn't fooled. I didn't need to look at them to know what was happening. It was like a trap closing around them, and they didn't even know how to get out. It wasn't just the affair that hurt anymore. It was the fact that they'd thought they could just get away with it. They thought they could betray me, break everything we had, and go on with their lives like nothing had happened. I wasn't about to let that slide. Not now, not ever. I didn't say anything as I walked back into the kitchen, my mind already set on what needed to happen. I was ready for the fallout, but I wasn't going to let fear or hesitation hold me back. I had given them too much. I had trusted them too much. And now, they were going to feel every ounce of that broken trust. I went straight for the family room, where Branton was sitting on the couch, trying to act normal. He looked up when I walked in, and for the first time in days, I saw something close to fear in his eyes. It wasn't just the guilt anymore. It was like he knew this was it. His entire world was about to shatter. Hannah was in the kitchen, talking to our mom, but I could hear her voice. Bright, fake, trying to act like nothing was wrong. She wasn't fooling anyone. Not anymore. I turned to Branton and stood there for a moment, just staring at him. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to avoid eye contact, but I wasn't going to make it easy for him. I wanted him to feel every second of this, feel how deeply I was about to rip into him. I didn't need to say much. The silence between us was enough. It was heavy. It was thick with all the words that didn't need to be spoken. Branton knew I knew. He knew I had everything figured out. Then I heard Hannah's voice behind me, that fake sweetness in it again. Jack, honey, everything's going to be okay, she said, walking into the room, probably thinking she could smooth things over with a few kind words. I didn't even look at her. My eyes stayed locked on Branton, and I could feel her falter, the tension building in her chest. The moment she realized I wasn't going to listen to her anymore, that I wasn't going to forgive her like I had before, the mask started to crack. Jack, please, she said again, her voice shaking now. She wasn't so confident anymore. The guilt was starting to seep through, the realization that there was no way out. I finally turned to her, but I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at her. Really looked at her. I saw the woman who used to be my wife, the one I thought I could trust, the one I built my life with. And all I could think was how badly she had betrayed me. How badly she had hurt me. It wasn't just the affair. It was the lies, the deceit, the way she'd pretended everything was fine while she was ripping apart the very foundation of our life together. Hannah's face started to flush. She could tell this wasn't going to go the way she had imagined. There was no more room for apologies. There were no more second chances. Not from me. I know about the affair, I said, my voice low and calm, but there was a weight to it that hit both of them like a punch. I didn't need to yell. The truth was enough. I could see the blood drain from Hannah's face as she realized I wasn't buying her act anymore. She opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't let her. I wasn't going to let her lie anymore. It's with Branton, isn't it? I said, turning to look at him. His face was pale now, his jaw tightening. He was trying to keep his composure, but it was slipping fast. He knew there was no getting out of this. Not anymore. He had already been caught, but now he was trapped in the worst way possible. By me. By his own brother. I watched him shift uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting around like he was searching for some way out, some way to make this stop. But it was too late. There was no going back now. Jack, please, Hannah started again, but I held up my hand. I wasn't going to let her finish her lies. I wasn't going to let her spin this into something it wasn't. There was no excuse for what she had done. There was no excuse for what Branton had done. This is over, I said, and the finality in my voice was undeniable. There was no room for negotiation. There was no room for fixing this. You've both destroyed everything we had. You've taken everything from me. And now you'll pay for it. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe a tearful apology. Maybe Branton trying to explain himself or Hannah begging for forgiveness. But neither of them did that. Instead, there was just silence. A long, uncomfortable silence that stretched between us. I could see the regret in both of their eyes. But it didn't matter. The damage had been done. Hannah finally spoke up, her voice shaky. Jack, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to happen. But her words felt hollow now, empty. She'd said the same thing 100 times before, and it never made a difference. It didn't matter anymore. There was no forgiveness for this. Branton finally stood up, his body stiff, his fists clenched. He was trying to put on that bravado, the same way he always did when he got caught, like he could still talk his way out of it. But there was nothing left to say. Nothing he could do to fix what he'd broken. You don't have to do this, he said, but I could see the fear in his eyes. The fear that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of this one. That this was it. Oh, I do, I said quietly. You both do. And that was the moment when everything started to unravel. I could feel it in my bones. I could feel the world around me begin to shift as the consequences of their actions were starting to catch up with them. What they had done wasn't just going to vanish. It was going to haunt them, just as it had haunted me. The air in the cabin felt like it was holding its breath, thick with the tension of everything that had just been said. Neither Hannah nor Branton moved. They just stood there, frozen, staring at me like they were waiting for the other shoe to drop. But I wasn't going to make it easy for them. The silence was thick, suffocating. I wanted them to feel it. Hannah finally broke, her face turning red as she stepped forward. Her voice was shaky, but there was a kind of steel behind it. Jack, we need to talk. This isn't how you should be dealing with this. We can fix it. I know we can. Just listen to me. But I wasn't listening. I didn't want to hear the same tired excuses, the same empty words that had already poisoned every conversation we'd had in the past few days. I wasn't interested in saving anything anymore. My marriage was over. I had nothing left to give her. I'm done, I said, coldly, my eyes never leaving hers. There's nothing left to fix. You made your choice, and now you have to deal with the consequences. She flinched like I'd slapped her. I could see the desperation in her eyes, but it didn't move me. Not anymore. She looked at Branton, but he was just standing there, too stunned to help, too ashamed to say anything. This was it. The moment she realized it was over. The moment she understood she couldn't worm her way out of this one. I didn't give her the chance to say anything else. I turned to Branton, who was still standing like he was in some kind of shock. He was looking at the floor, his fists clenched. It was almost pathetic. The cocky, self-assured brother I used to know had crumbled in front of me, and I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for him. Not after what he did. You ruined everything, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Not just my marriage. You ruined everything. You betrayed me in a way I'll never forget. He didn't respond at first. I think he was still trying to figure out how to play this, how to spin it, but there was no spin left. Nothing he could say would fix what had happened. I'd already seen through all the lies. And I was past the point of caring. Branton opened his mouth like he was about to speak, but no words came out. The look in his eyes was different now. There was no arrogance, no confidence. Just shame. And the worst part? He knew exactly what was coming for him. I could feel the adrenaline starting to build, the rage that had been simmering under the surface finally bubbling over. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to make him feel the weight of what he'd done to me, to my family, to everything I had worked for. But I didn't do it. Instead, I stood there, letting the silence stretch on, letting him stew in it. I'm done with both of you, I said. And for the first time in days, I felt like I was finally saying something that mattered. I wasn't just reacting. I wasn't just hurt. I was done. And I had nothing left to lose. The truth of it hit me harder than I expected. My whole world was falling apart, but at least now I had control. They had taken everything from me, but now I was the one holding the power. The power to destroy everything they had built, everything they had taken from me. Hannah, still desperate, took a step forward, but I held my hand up, stopping her in her tracks. No, I said. Not this time. I'm not listening to you anymore. You don't get to play the victim. You've already made your bed. Now you're going to lie in it. She didn't say anything after that. She just stood there, eyes wide, her face twisted in a mixture of anger and regret. But there was no more sympathy from me. No more understanding. I turned away from both of them and walked out the door. The cool air hit me like a slap to the face, but I didn't care. I needed space. I needed to think. I paced around the yard, trying to keep my breathing steady. I could hear Hannah and Branton talking behind me, their voices rising and falling, but I didn't want to hear it. I didn't need to hear it. I already knew what they were saying. It was more lies, more explanations that wouldn't change a thing. When I came back inside, I was a man with a plan. I had everything in place. It was time to make sure the consequences didn't just affect them in the short term. No, they needed to feel it long term. I wasn't going to let them walk away from this. First things first, Branton's business. I'd already made a few calls, but now I needed to turn the pressure up. The whispers would continue to spread, slowly but surely, until his reputation was in tatters. I wasn't going to stop until every deal he'd made, every shady transaction he'd been involved in, was out in the open for everyone to see. He'd never be able to show his face in business again. And then there was Hannah. She thought she could walk away from this, slip back into her life and pretend it hadn't happened. But I wasn't going to let that happen. The same people who'd whispered about Branton's business dealings would soon start whispering about her, too. She would feel it at every turn. The side glances, the cancelled plans, the whispers in the hallways. Her social life, the one she had so carefully curated, would come crumbling down. But it wouldn't just be social. It would be personal. She'd lost me. And that meant something. It meant she would never be able to look at Branton the same way again. She'd lost everything she thought she could hold on to. Their affair had stolen everything from me, but now it was going to take everything from them. I wasn't just ruining their reputations. I was making sure they'd never find peace. They'd always look over their shoulders, always wonder when the next shoe would drop. And the best part? They'd never be able to blame me. They could blame each other, they could blame the world, but the truth was clear. They'd made their choices, and now they'd have to live with them. Forever. The next few days felt like a blur. I was riding a wave of cold, calculated anger, doing everything I could to make sure they understood the full weight of what they'd done. But I wasn't doing it out of rage anymore. That had passed. This was methodical. This was payback. And the more I moved, the more I made sure that every choice they made from now on would be tangled up in the consequences of their betrayal. Branton had tried to contact me a few times. Texts, voicemails, even a couple of emails. At first, I didn't bother reading any of it. I knew exactly what he'd say. Sorry, man. I screwed up. Please understand. But I didn't need to hear any more of his excuses. The fact was, his apologies were as hollow as the trust one used to have in him. And I wasn't the type of guy who believed in second chances for something like this. Hannah, on the other hand, was relentless. She'd show up at the cabin, pacing the front porch like some desperate, wounded animal, begging me to talk to her. She'd leave me voice messages that were practically pleading, all about how she was so sorry, how this wasn't who she was, and how we could work it out if I just gave her another chance. It was pathetic, honestly. I was watching her unravel, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I'd remember what they had done, what she had done, and any shred of sympathy I might have felt evaporated. There was no going back. No way to unring the bell. But while they were both stuck in their own misery, I was making sure the consequences kept stacking up. It wasn't just about their personal lives anymore. It was about their entire future. I had already made calls to a few of my contacts in the local news outlets. I fed them enough information about Branton's shady dealings to make sure they'd bite. It wasn't enough to just ruin his reputation in town. I wanted to make sure that his business partners knew exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. I talked to a few of the people he owed money to, too. Subtle enough not to get caught, but enough to put a dent in his finances. It wasn't hard. Branton had always been careless with his connections, too busy trying to play the big shot to worry about who knew what. The articles started popping up a couple of days later. Just a few local whispers at first, about financial mismanagement, unethical business practices, and a vague mention of pending investigations. I could tell they were getting to him. His calls were getting more frantic. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced with desperation. He was a man who could feel the walls closing in, and he had no one to blame but himself. Hannah's fall from grace was slower but just as effective. I hadn't been able to keep my distance from the family entirely, especially with our parents around. But I made sure every conversation they had about her was riddled with questions and whispers. I'd drop little things when I spoke to my mom or my cousins. How her relationship with Branton had gone on longer than she'd admitted, how she'd lied to everyone, how she thought she could hide it and go on like nothing had happened. Hannah had always cared deeply about her image. how she was seen by the family, by our friends. And once those cracks started showing, once people started turning their backs on her, she couldn't handle it. At first, it was just awkward silences when she'd walk into a room. Then, people started canceling plans. Invitations to family gatherings dried up. Her friends stopped calling. Slowly, the realization hit her. There was no place left for her to hide. No one believed her anymore. Not the way they used to. It was like watching someone slowly sink under the surface of the water, trying to gasp for air but never quite reaching it. As much as I wanted to feel satisfied, I couldn't completely shake the emptiness in my chest. I had done what I set out to do. I had broken them. But in the process, I'd shattered something inside myself too. This wasn't the victory I thought it would be. I'd destroyed the people who had destroyed me, but in the end, I was still the one left holding the wreckage. The emptiness that followed was almost worse than the betrayal itself. I didn't talk to Hannah or Branton for days after that. I didn't need to. Everything was playing out exactly how I wanted it to. But when I finally heard from Branton again, it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't more apologies or begging. Instead, he showed up at the cabin. I saw his truck pulling up the long driveway late one evening. I wasn't sure whether to feel annoyed or curious. I wasn't looking for closure. Hell, I wasn't sure I ever could get that with him. But when he walked through the door, I could see that he wasn't the cocky younger brother who used to get away with everything. He was a man stripped bare of everything he thought he could rely on. "I know you're pissed at me, Jack. I don't expect you to forgive me, but," he trailed off, looking at me like I was some kind of stranger. "I just wanted to say, you were right. About everything. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I've lost everything," he continued, his voice tight. "I've lost my career, my reputation, my friends. Hell, I don't even know if anyone in the family will talk to me again. I've burned it all, and I don't know how to fix it." I still didn't respond. I didn't want to hear any of it. He had made his bed. He could lie in it. "I'm sorry. I just wanted you to know that." He stood there for a second, waiting for some kind of reaction from me. When I didn't say anything, when I just stared at him coldly, he nodded, turning to leave. "Good luck, Branton," I finally said, my voice steady, but there was no warmth in it. "You're gonna need it." I watched him walk out, but it wasn't the same. There was no satisfaction in it anymore. No relief. Just nothing. Hannah didn't show up after that. Not that I was surprised. She'd already seen enough. The family wasn't going to rally behind her this time. There was no hiding the truth anymore. For a while, I kept my distance, focusing on the few things that still brought me peace. Getting back into a routine, taking care of myself, making sure I didn't let their destruction pull me under. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about Branton or Hannah. It was about me, finally taking control over something that had been ripped away from me. And in the end, that was the hardest part to swallow. The aftermath was complete, but I wasn't sure what I had left. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to move on. I threw myself into work, kept busy with projects, and took long walks around the property to clear my head. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling that something had shifted permanently. Not just between me and Hannah, or me and Branton, but deep inside myself. They had taken so much from me. My trust. My marriage. My sense of who I thought I was. And no matter how many little victories I had in tearing them down, I couldn't stop asking myself one thing. Was it worth it? I didn't expect an answer. But the question lingered, gnawing at me like a dull ache. Revenge, it turns out, doesn't fill the hole you think it will. It's not some magical antidote to pain. It doesn't smooth things over or give you peace. It just makes everything more complicated, more messy, more empty. I still couldn't believe the depths of the betrayal. I didn't know which hurt worse, Hannah's lies or the fact that Branton, my own damn brother, had been the one to destroy everything I thought I had. Both of them had known me inside out, had seen my strengths and weaknesses, my flaws and fears. And yet, they chose to burn everything down. I didn't know how to feel about that. I didn't know how to process it. I had a couple of moments where I thought maybe it was time to let it all go, let the revenge fade and just heal. But every time I considered it, something pulled me back. Some lingering rage, some nagging sense of justice that I hadn't yet fully exacted. Maybe it was because I still didn't feel like I'd really broken them. The damage I'd done to their reputations was bad, sure, but I wasn't satisfied yet. They hadn't suffered enough. Not in the way I needed them to. It wasn't until I got a call from my cousin Carla that I realized just how deep the cracks ran. "Jack, I don't know how to tell you this," she said, her voice thick with hesitation. "But Branton's planning to leave town. He says he's done. He's going to sell his place and move somewhere else." I leaned against the wall, suddenly feeling the weight of her words. The first reaction I had was relief. Good. Let him run. Let him hide. But then, something else followed. A strange sense of loss. I couldn't help it. That was my brother, the one I had fought with, laughed with, shared memories with. The one I thought would always have my back. "Are you sure?" I asked, though deep down, I already knew the answer. Branton didn't just quit. He was running. And that fact, more than anything, hurt worse than I could explain. "I'm sure. I mean, he's done. Everyone's cutting ties with him. People are talking about what happened, Jack. I don't think he's going to make it through this." And that was the kicker, wasn't it? It wasn't just the affair that had ruined Branton. It was the fact that the family was slowly but surely turning their backs on him, one by one. It wasn't just his reputation anymore. It was his very place in the world. He had nowhere to hide, nowhere to go. And as much as I hated him for what he'd done, part of me couldn't stand the thought of him just disappearing. That was what revenge had gotten me. An endless cycle of destruction. I didn't know if I wanted to watch him crumble to the point where he'd give up and leave. But I couldn't help it. I was glad he was suffering. Even if I hated that I felt that way. Carla paused, as if she was waiting for me to say something. Finally, I let out a deep breath and muttered, "Tell him I don't care where he goes." I wasn't sure if I meant that or not. The truth was, part of me still wanted him to suffer the way I had. Part of me still wanted to watch him try to crawl out of the hole he'd dug for himself. But something else, something deeper, was rising inside me too. Regret. Or maybe, just maybe, the first inklings of forgiveness. I hated it. I didn't want to forgive him. He didn't deserve it. But there was something about seeing him break so completely that made me question my own need to hold on to this grudge. When I hung up with Carla, I sat there in silence, staring out at the cabin's front porch. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the yard. It was almost beautiful in a way that made everything feel small. I couldn't make sense of it all. I was left alone with my thoughts, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the hole inside me wasn't going to be filled by revenge or anger or even the destruction of Branton and Hannah's lives. It wasn't enough. I stood up, wiped my face with my hands, and looked at the door. I couldn't stay in this place forever. I couldn't keep living in this anger, feeding it, hoping it would bring me the peace I thought I needed. It was time to move on. Time to get out. But what did moving on even mean now? I had lost my brother. I had lost my wife. I had lost myself in the process of all this. And the only thing I was left with was a fractured version of who I had been before all of this happened. So, I made a decision. Not to forgive. Not to forget. But to walk away. From them. From this place. From the past. I picked up the phone again, but this time, I wasn't making calls to sabotage Brandon's career or make sure Hannah couldn't show her face around family. This time, I was calling a real estate agent. I needed to leave. The cabin, the town, all the memories, everything had become a ghost, haunting me with its echoes of what I had lost. I wasn't going to heal overnight. That much I knew. But maybe, just maybe, if I got out, if I put some distance between myself and all of them, I could start figuring out who I was again. Not as the guy who had been betrayed. Not as the guy who had taken revenge. But as Jack. Just Jack. The man who had been left with nothing, but who was still breathing. The next chapter was mine to write. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, calls, and packing. Selling the cabin wasn't an easy decision. It had been a part of my family for years, a place of refuge and memories. But every time I looked at it, all I saw was the wreckage. The place where everything I thought I knew about trust and loyalty had fallen apart. It was time for a clean break. The agent came by a few days later to put up the "for sale" sign. I didn't stick around for the details. I didn't need to. I was already mentally checked out. There was nothing left for me here. I didn't want to live in the place that had been tainted by their betrayal. It wasn't just the physical space. It was everything the cabin represented. The lies. The broken bonds. The family I'd thought I had, which had turned out to be a house of cards ready to fall apart at the slightest touch. I didn't want to be the guy who stayed stuck in the past. But, let's be real, leaving wasn't easy. Not emotionally. Not mentally. As much as I'd wanted to walk away from everything, I still found myself coming back to the question that had been gnawing at me for weeks. What now? What happens after the revenge, after the dust settles, after everything you've built your life around is gone? I hadn't talked to Hannah or Branton since that day at the cabin. I hadn't reached out, and I hadn't received any more calls or messages from them, either. Part of me figured they were both just licking their wounds and trying to find some way to piece their lives back together. But another part of me felt that familiar anger stir when I thought about them. The betrayal was still raw, still deep. And in some twisted way, I didn't want them to forget what they'd done. Not too soon, at least. But as the weeks passed, the anger started to feel like it was running out of steam. It wasn't that I forgave them. Hell, I didn't even want to forgive them. But I realized something important. The revenge hadn't changed a damn thing. They were still out there, living their lives. Probably miserable, sure, but they were living. And I had spent all this time trying to make them suffer. Meanwhile, I was the one who'd lost. I was the one who'd spent countless nights thinking about what I could do to make them pay. But in the end, it only hurt me. It wasn't enough. It never would be. So when I finally left the cabin behind and moved to a new place, an apartment in the city, closer to work and farther from all the memories, I found myself with more space than I'd ever had before. Not just physically, but mentally. I had the time and energy to start thinking about what I really wanted from life. And I knew one thing. It wasn't them. It couldn't be. I couldn't keep letting them consume me. The first few days in the new apartment were strange. It felt empty, quiet. No more family gatherings. No more random drop-ins from friends or people in the neighborhood. Just me, and a lot of unfinished thoughts swirling around in my head. But slowly, as the days dragged on, something shifted. I started sleeping better. I started eating better. I began filling the silence with things that weren't about Hannah or Branton. I took up some hobbies I'd left behind years ago. Photography, reading, getting back into fitness. I wasn't trying to forget what had happened. I couldn't do that. But I realized that in order to move forward, I had to stop being so obsessed with the past. I started running again. Not just for the physical benefits, but because it gave me something to focus on. The rhythmic pounding of my feet on the pavement helped clear the noise in my head. The kind of noise that comes from constantly playing out different scenarios in your mind, from reliving every single moment of betrayal and regret. It gave me a way to keep the dark thoughts at bay, to push them aside for just a little while. One Saturday, a few weeks after moving in, I was sitting on my couch with a beer in hand when I got a message from Carla. I hadn't heard from her in a while, and at first, I thought it was going to be more family gossip. But it wasn't. It was about Branton. He's leaving town. For good, Carla said. I think he's gone as far as he can hear. He's packing up and heading out, trying to start fresh somewhere new. I stared at the message for a long time, letting it sink in. Branton was leaving, just like he said he would. He was running away from everything he'd destroyed, trying to put some distance between himself and the wreckage. Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction. A small part of me even thought it was funny. But the rest of me, well, I felt nothing. It was like hearing about a stranger. Someone I used to know but no longer recognized. I didn't respond to Carla right away. What was there to say? The truth was, I didn't care. I wasn't going to chase him down. I wasn't going to offer some last, painful piece of advice. He was on his own. I had my own life to sort out. And the best part? I didn't have to carry around the anger and the hate anymore. The next morning, I took a walk through the city. It was a gray, overcast day, and I kind of liked it. It matched how I'd been feeling for months, like the sky was just as empty and heavy as I'd been. But as I walked, I realized something. The world was still turning. The streets were still full of people rushing around, busy with their own lives. The sun would break through the clouds eventually, and life would go on. I wasn't done healing. Hell, I wasn't even sure how to start healing after everything that had happened. But I had the sense that maybe, just maybe, I could take a step forward. I didn't have to forgive Branton or Hannah, but I could choose to stop letting them define me. I didn't have to let their mistakes be the last thing that defined my life. I wasn't free yet. I didn't know if I ever would be. But I was starting to feel like I could be. Like I could finally start living for me again. And that, in the end, was worth more than any kind of revenge I could have ever taken. The road ahead was still long. But for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of it. It had been a couple of months since I moved into the city, and I was starting to settle into a rhythm I hadn't felt in a long time. The mornings were quieter, more peaceful. I wasn't surrounded by memories of the betrayal anymore. No constant reminders of the cabin, no awkward family gatherings, no running into Branton or Hannah at random places in town. There were no more angry messages or guilt trips. It was just me, and the life I was starting to rebuild. I didn't have it all figured out, though. Some days, the weight of everything still hit me out of nowhere. An old song on the radio, a photo on my phone, a name I saw pop up in a text from a mutual friend. Little things that made it all come rushing back. The pain, the anger, the betrayal. The sleepless nights where I replayed their faces, their lies, their smiles behind my back. It didn't just go away. You don't get over something like that, no matter how many times you tell yourself you're moving on. But I wasn't the same guy I was when I first found out about the affair. I wasn't some naive fool, blinded by love or loyalty, looking for revenge at any cost. I'd done what I had to do. I had taken my pound of flesh. It hadn't healed me, but it had changed the way I looked at things. I wasn't waiting for some grand closure anymore. The only closure I could count on was the one I gave myself, by choosing to keep going, no matter how hard it was, no matter how much it hurt. The hardest part wasn't just getting over the betrayal, though. It was learning to trust myself again. Because the truth was, when they both turned on me, I lost faith in my own judgment. How could I not? These were people I'd known my whole life. People I thought I could count on through anything. But when the storm hit, when everything came crashing down, they were the ones who turned their backs. And if they could do that, what did that say about me? I spent a lot of time thinking about that. Did I miss something? Had I been so blinded by my own trust that I didn't see the warning signs? I guess, looking back, I probably had my suspicions. There were those little moments, the ones that now seemed so obvious. But I didn't want to see them for what they were. I was too busy holding on to the version of reality I'd built. The one where everything was okay, where everything was normal. I wasn't sure how long it would take to rebuild trust in myself, but I had to start somewhere. I had to believe that, even if I'd made mistakes, I could still make better choices moving forward. And part of that meant cutting ties with the people who had taken so much from me. The last time I saw Hannah was at a friend's wedding, one I'd almost skipped, but decided at the last minute to go to. I didn't expect her to be there. Honestly, I didn't expect to run into anyone from our old life at all. But there she was, standing at the edge of the reception hall, looking out of place in a way that almost made me feel sorry for her. She didn't see me at first, but when she did, she froze. Her eyes went wide. She'd probably been hoping to avoid me, just like I'd been hoping to avoid her. I didn't approach her. I didn't need to. I wasn't looking for some dramatic confrontation. I had no desire to hash things out. In fact, I wasn't even angry when I saw her. Not in that moment. I just felt indifferent. She was a stranger to me now. A stranger who had once been my wife, and who had destroyed that version of me. But I didn't need her anymore. Not in the way I thought I did before. She eventually walked away, probably hoping I wouldn't make a scene. I didn't. I didn't want anything to do with her. So, I spent the rest of the evening mingling with people who weren't tied to the past. People who didn't know about the mess I had lived through. I spent time with friends, talked to strangers, danced, and even laughed. It was the first time I felt like I wasn't dragging a piece of myself behind me. I was still figuring things out, but I was moving forward. A few days later, I got a text from my mom. It was short, simple, just her asking if I was okay. I could tell she was trying to bridge the gap between us. But what could I say? I wasn't angry at her. I wasn't angry at anyone in the family, not really. I wasn't even angry at the people who sided with Hannah and Branton, at least not anymore. Everyone had their own reasons for doing what they did. I didn't have to agree with them, but I could let it go. I texted her back. I'm good. Just figuring things out, but I'm okay. I left it at that. A couple of weeks later, I heard from Branton. Not in person, he wouldn't dare show his face around me again, but in a message. One of those long, rambling texts full of apologies, just like the ones he'd sent before. He didn't mention the affair. He didn't mention anything specific. Just that he was sorry for everything. That he regretted it. That he hoped we could one day figure things out. I didn't respond. I wasn't going to. I didn't need to. The old me, the one who was driven by anger and pain, might have thought I needed to tear into him, to make him feel what I felt. But that wasn't who I was anymore. I didn't need that kind of closure. I didn't need anything from him at all. What I needed was peace. What I needed was to stop letting him, or Hannah, or anyone else define my life. The revenge I'd taken had done its job. It had made sure they both paid for what they did. But now it was time to move on. For real. I wasn't forgetting what happened. I couldn't. But I was finally learning to live with it. To carry it without letting it drag me down. And in that quiet, steady acceptance, I felt something new. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. A glimpse of freedom.